Hi there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lessons in Leadership, the podcast brought to you by MLK Search with a mission to drive more awareness and knowledge around leadership within the education sector. My name's Steve Lyons, and as always, we'll be cracking on and digging into our guest's background and journey into school leadership, his take on the current landscape of leadership recruitment, and also gathering some of his top tips for any would-be leaders in education. My guest today is Matt Turton. I'm absolutely chuffed to have him on. I've known him for a few years now. Matt's just moved into a new role as principal at the Blue Coat Aspley Academy in Nottingham, which is part of the Archway Learning Trust. Prior to that, I'd worked with Matt when he was Director of Performance and Standards at the St Therese of Lisieux Multi-Academy Trust in Lincolnshire, where he was also the interim head of the St Peter and St Paul Catholic Academy Trust. As I said, he's a super guy, really lovely fella, wealth of experience for someone so young, and I really appreciate you coming on today, Matt, especially on a day when A-level results are being rolled out across the country as well, so thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Brilliant. Matt, we've known each other for a few years. I've never really dug into your background. Obviously, I knew what your roles were in the past, but as always, we do this with every guest. Could you really give us some background into, where you were raised, sort of what your schooling was like, and then why ultimately you decided to get into teaching in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on. I think this is such an important series that you're trying to develop in terms of the wider development of leadership around schools and culture and climate. So I know we'll dig into some of those things a bit later on. Originally from Cheshire. So I grew up in Cheshire, near Chester, so on the kind of Welsh border side, really. Went to school there, Catholic high school over in Ellesmere Port. Was there all the way through GCSEs, A levels. It's interesting because my kind of trade is a science teacher, and that was back in the days where actually you had the option of doing a single science or double science. Nowadays you're pushing kids for triple science if it's the right thing for them, but as it stands, double science went through, and actually it wasn't until the point at which I chose my options at sixth form that I decided I wanted to do science. So I wasn't even going to do sciences at A level at all. But really, unfortunately, it was when the options didn't fit in the option blocks, as is the way, isn't it? And it then takes you down a different avenue. And so I went into do the sciences at A level, sciences and French, applied for medicine at university, didn't get into medicine at university, as I got the offers, got a couple of offers, didn't get the grades, and just went a different way and did an undergrad. Could have gone then and applied for medicine, decided it wasn't for me, really, when you look at the caliber of other people around you that didn't get into medicine, thinking, I'm not as intelligent as you are, there's not a chance I've got against you in an interview. So then just went down the kind of PGCE route to teaching and never looked back, really. So moved across to Nottingham from Cheshire to do my PGCE, did my degree over in Liverpool. So yeah, I've had quite a diverse upbringing in terms of catchment, in terms of what I've seen, what I've experienced geographically, and as you say, working across in Lincolnshire and now coming back to work in Nottinghamshire again, got quite a broad range of experience geographically and contextually as well.
Wow, perfect. And how did you find your PGCE? What did you find that quite challenging? And so talk me through sort of how that PGCE was, what you sort of learned initially, because that really is your first step. You might have had some experience volunteering. When I did mine, it was very much, you might have volunteered a little bit before then going on to your PGCE, and then you sort of hit with it a few weeks in. So talk us through that, and then obviously securing that first job as well.
Yeah, I mean, I did a course during my degree through the Open University, which was something along the lines of trying to get people into schools, particularly in science, because my degree was in science, then in anatomy. So I then went into schools for a couple of weeks in Cheshire to look at how schools work, look at how teachers work. So I guess it's a bit like the internships that run at the minute, trying to get people in, trying to engage people in science and science education. So that gave me a bit of an insight into it, but I hadn't really, as you kind of say, had done much up until that point. A couple of days in a primary school, which again was a whole other ball game.
Yeah.
So I admire massively those that work in all sectors of education, but particularly primary. I think it's fascinating, but not for me in terms of the leadership, certainly. Having that many small people around it, I just couldn't cope with it. But really, the thing that was most drastic and most stark was the two different placements on PGCE. So working in a really challenging inner city school first placement, then going to work in a relatively more affluent school second placement, and actually I ended up getting a job. So my job experience in terms of getting my first job was a bit surreal, really, that I was offered a job, but not really, in as much as here's a job that you can apply for. You might be the only candidate sort of thing. And, ended up getting a job that way in one of my placement schools for PGCE. I never looked back really, loved it. And actually in my first placement school, I learned everything I've ever learned about behaviour management. It was one of the most challenging places, and I've been a football referee, at sort of semi-professional type level, Sunday morning pubs and that sort. And actually, the most challenging behaviour I've ever experienced has not been doing that. It's been in a classroom in inner city Nottingham. You end up with year 11s just having fight, and it's that sort of thing. And I think people sometimes don't realise that that comes with education. That is part of being a teacher on a daily basis, and actually how you then engage those students to learn some stuff, to learn some science, to get some qualifications out of it, and inspiring them to do that is it's an incredible honour to be able to do it. But for me, really trying to get them my first job post PGCE was different to how most people had done that. And it was interesting because I got my first job quite early in the academic year on PGCE. I was looking around thinking, I've got a job really early. And then you realise why when you learn more about the school you're about to go into. But I wouldn't change it for the world because it taught me everything. And I did a stint of time there, loved it, had its challenges in terms of student behaviour, in terms of, a couple of other things. But every school has its challenges, irrelevant of what the school's like, irrelevant of what the culture's like, irrelevant of what the behaviour's like in a school. And that's a big thing about leadership, behaviour management, and how you do that. Irrelevant of all those things, actually, it's taught me so much being in that context.
So how long were you at your first school then? So once you got that first role, were you there for a number of years? How long were you your first job?
1 year. So I did my first placement there up until Christmas in PGCE, then was offered the job. And they were in the days in PGCE where you then went back to your first placement school. So I went back there in the June and then worked effectively as an unqualified teacher, June, July. And then it's a good thing they paid me through the summer as well, which was great. Anyone that's looking at teaching, that you can get paid through the summer in your first year, that's a bonus. And then just 1 year stayed there. And then actually a job came up in my second placement school that I applied for and got that. So I then left after a year to go to a different school. And that's where I'd been for about another 10 years after then at that point. So I stayed at that school and just did different roles all the way through.
So did you find your step into leadership came at that second school then? So where your second placement was? And I'm assuming, obviously, having a science background, that was a secondary school as well, Matt, because obviously, from conversations we've had with other guests, is that sometimes the path into leadership is different in primary, perhaps, to secondary, because there's, obviously more staff in secondary as well. It might be more competitive. So why did you go into leadership, and how did you manage to do that within that school?
I think it's a combination of things. And I think that going into leadership for me has always been about and will always be about making the biggest difference. And it's where do I feel I can make the biggest difference to young people? And that sounds really, really cliche, but actually it's true for me, for me certainly, and for every leader, I imagine. It's where can I make the biggest difference? How can I have an impact on these young people? And again, going back to what I said earlier, particularly to students where socioeconomically, actually, they might not have had the most, financially, academically. It's where can I get the best outcomes for these young people? So for me, that was always what it was about, and what I was, wanting to do and be. And my aspiration coming into education was then always to be a head teacher. So for me, getting into leadership was just I'll try it, and if I don't like it, then I've not lost anything. And even early in my career, I ended up taking a couple of leadership roles in the science department as a head of year, kind of the middle leadership level. And I say this to anyone that are listening in leadership, my favourite role I've ever done, notwithstanding, headship, obviously, you have to say that, don't you, is head of year. Pastoral work is so undervalued, I think, in schools, not by staff in schools, but I think, lots of people in leadership talk about, you need to have done a curriculum-based role to be successful, certainly in future leadership. But I think actually, if you can engage pastorally with young people, yes, staff are difficult to manage sometimes, and yes, curriculum leadership and academic leadership gives you that skill set. But if you can demonstrate resilience, perseverance, and impact at pastoral level, actually, for me as a leader in a school, you're very, very employable, because you've got a skill set that works with our customer base, which is our students, our young people.
Wow. And did you find, was it a Catholic school? So obviously you've worked in Catholic education, so I'm assuming that was a Catholic school when you went into that. So were the nuances, because obviously there are nuances in terms of going into leadership within Catholic education. So did you find that helped? Obviously being a Catholic yourself, were there nuances there where that either helped or sort of held you back a little bit potentially on going into leadership?
Yeah. So my first school wasn't Catholic. I myself am Catholic, and my second school was Catholic, and I think that for me was one of the reasons as to looking to move across and moving into Catholic education. I'd experienced it on PGCE. I loved what it stood for. I think faith education is incredibly valuable, and I know lots of parents aspire for their children, whether they're of faith or not, to go to faith-based schools, because I think that what they teach students as well-rounded individuals. I'm not saying other schools don't by any stretch of the imagination, but the way that they do that is very different in a faith-based school. And I think until you immerse yourself in it, doing a day or two or a week or two doesn't really give you that. But yeah, for me, certainly going into faith-based education was what I wanted to do. And for me, as a Catholic, going back into Catholic school to look at leadership in Catholic schools was what I was aspiring towards. And yeah, I do think, being frank, I do think it helped fundamentally being Catholic in a Catholic school. To be deputy, to be head, as a reserve post in Catholic education, you have to be Catholic, a practicing Catholic. So that does help, and I'm not naive to that. That has helped me during my career. Absolutely, it has. But I do think you also need a certain level of skill and a certain level of, again, particularly as a scientist, as you alluded to, big, relatively big school, loads of middle leadership roles to be able to go and get your teeth into and engage with. And I think getting the breadth of experience when you're ready in your career is really important. If you can pastoral, if you can academic and curriculum, and I think that's the big thing that holds people back, is a lack of curriculum-based experience, irrelevant of what I think about that not being as important as maybe people perceive it to be. I do think, in this day and age, people do still think curriculum experience is very, very important.
Yeah, of course. And is that where you found your first headship then, Matt?
No, so it happened by chance, really. And again, Catholic education is a very interesting place to be. I loved it, and I'm stepping out of that presently. That's the next school I'm moving on to is Church of England, but it's not in the Catholic education, not in the Catholic trusts in the East Midlands. So for me, I worked all the way through at my second school, all the way up to assistant head level, and then took on a director of teaching school role, which basically was looking and supporting school improvement and CPD and teacher training across the diocese in across the whole of the East Midlands. And that gave me experiences of many, many different schools, many different leaders, and you learn so much. And this is not meant critically, but you learn things that you would do and you would magpie, but you also learn things that either you don't have the credibility yourself to do, but also things that you would never attempt to do yourself, because it's not the way that you work and it's not what you want for your school if you get a headship moving forward. And for me, actually working in that kind of diocese gave me access to so many different people. And really, when I ended up taking on a headship, it happened to be in a school in Lincolnshire, so still in the diocese. But the CEO knew of me from my work in the teaching school, so I stepped across as an acting deputy for 6 months, and then the headship came up, and I was in the right place at the right time to be able to take that on, albeit a temporary post. As you say, my actual substantive role is Director of Performance and Standards, so theoretically working within the trust executive team, but there was a need at the time for the school to have a head teacher that in post. And recruitment in Catholic education is challenging, and I will kind of pick on that a bit more later, but really, really challenging, particularly in a demographic of Lincolnshire, which is quite spread out and disparate. And they needed, particularly during start of COVID, some stability in that school for the staff. So as a result of that, that's where I ended up in my first headship for a couple of years, and now I'm moving on to my second headship for September 2022.
Lovely. And it was interesting you mentioned working when you had the Teaching School Alliance, which is where we first met actually quite a few years ago now. What were, you mentioned working with a number of different people where you could pick things out and say, yes, that's brilliant, I'm going to use that, and maybe not that because I have the credibility and everything else you were saying there. What were the biggest things that you learned by working with those leaders, would you say?
I think it's the context matters so much, and actually, going into one school and trying to bring ideas from school A to school B isn't going to work identically in both settings because the context is different. Even if you are two schools up the road from each other with relatively similar catchments, actually the variables are still enough to mean that you have to modify, you have to tweak, you have to respond to the context of the school. And for me, that was one of my biggest challenges of leadership at that level, looking actually if going and doing some school improvement work. As a science, former head of science as well, I would go to lots of schools to do science school improvement work. Here's some stuff that we do at my current school, doesn't always work in other settings. So that for me was one of the biggest things. Context-based leadership is incredibly important.
Yeah, and you had the Diocesan Leadership Academy whilst you were in that post. So tell me more about that, because I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, so effectively what the diocese did, identifying that there was a need for Catholic leaders in Catholic education, is they asked me as part of my role to lead on the Diocesan Leadership Academy. So two different cohorts. One was for developing leaders, so those in kind of early years, kind of NQT now, kind of RQT, ECT type, who were looking at middle to early senior leadership. So probably in the first 1 to 6 years of their career, do they have a set of skills and competencies that would allow them to progress into leadership in the future, senior leadership? And they applied, they were selected, and there was a group of those colleagues across the diocese, and a package, devised a package of support working with experts in different areas to get them upskilled. And again, often in leadership, knowledge is really, really important, and knowledge is often missing from leaders. So you don't know what you don't know until you're told it. So, for example, what's a SEF? What does SEF actually mean? What is a school development plan? How does it look? How does it work? Until that's explained to you, you're never going to understand the complexities of it. So even at that level of leadership, explaining those sorts of things, a little bit about finance and how that works in a trust, HR, policy, procedure, all those things at leadership level, middle leadership and early senior leadership is important knowledge, because I don't think you can ever become a fully rounded leader until you've done everything. And even as a head teacher, you've not done everything. At the top level, at the kind of advanced level, it was then looking at aspirant head teachers for the Leadership Academy. So those colleagues who were practicing Catholics, who met the requirements of practicing Catholic, who were looking likely within the next 3 to 5 years, maybe sooner, of becoming headship, a candidate for that, and putting those colleagues through a training program, a training schedule over a couple of years that actually meant that they had knowledge, skills, development that allowed them, and that was built on feedback from CEOs, from the Director of Education, of this is generally what our head teachers need support with or would have liked to have had before they took on headship. Again, in Catholic education, what does the diocesan canonical inspection framework look like? Until you get to, until you're a deputy head teacher or a head teacher in charge of Catholic life in a Catholic school, you don't have much of a clue about that. So it's trying to upskill those colleagues to make them as well-rounded as possible, so that they are very credible, as I mentioned before, credible candidates for senior leadership and headship.
And without what I mean, I suppose I'm skipping ahead a bit of what I wanted to discuss later, but which is fine. In regards to the people that went through that academy, were they signposted by their current head teacher, CEO, or did they go forward for that themselves? So how did you identify who might be a potential leader within a school?
Yeah, a combination of both those things, and really there was an application process to go through. They then identified themselves, the head teacher had to support them with a reference, and there was an interview process for it. Looking at, again, skills, competencies for staff. Again, not critically, but actually, if the diocese and the trust were putting money in to support these colleagues and their progression, then it was the right thing to do to make sure they were the valuable candidates. And actually, you look at all businesses, they have succession planning models in place. They make sure they've got a real pipeline of internal, never mind external staff that come in. But that's really, really important in Catholic education for Catholic leaders, because there aren't many out there. So you've got to grow your own as a starting point. And from that perspective, that's what the diocese were very, very keen on doing, is growing their own leaders. And not to say that you can't get from outside, because you absolutely can. And I think it's important for any organisation to recruit externally as well, to bring that fresh blood into teams, into schools. But I think that when you're looking at Catholic education as as a whole, Catholic leadership is very difficult to recruit into. So that was the model they've adopted.
Okay. And then obviously you ended up becoming an interim deputy head and an interim head, and you were there for, was it 2 years? I think you were there.
Yeah, just short of, yeah.
Just short of 2 years. So obviously you stepped into that role. As you said before, it was based in Lincoln, so it's, you know, it's not surrounded by other cities, for example. It's in Lincolnshire. What were your major learning curves stepping into that headship?
Well, as I say, it was November 2020, so it was just kind of mid-peak of COVID, and lots of change, lots of development, and education. You know, lots of sectors. I remember being asked this on an interview process previously, and this was, you know, about 5-6 years ago. I applied for a job elsewhere, and one of the questions that I was asked was, "What will the impact of Brexit be on education?" I'm thinking, crikey, this is an early senior leadership role. I'm thinking this is the question that I'm being asked. So I stopped and thought for a second and thought, do you know what? Actually, in education, we are so used to change. And I think many sectors are like oil tankers turning round, and they turn so slowly that by the time the next change comes, they haven't actually adapted to the first change yet. But in education, we're so used to changing so frequently, and that's what it was like during COVID. It literally was a change a day, and you know, something will come out. You know, you're talking about wearing masks and not wearing masks, and on-site testing and all these things. And actually, that's when being part of a trust is really important, or being part of a really strong network if you're not in a trust, because you have those links of people that you can bounce off. And I think one of the things for leadership, you know, one of the things that I'll maybe mention later as well, is about having a network of people. You can't do leadership on your own, whether that be in your school, whether that be outside of your school. You've got to have a really, really good network of people, because if you haven't got that, you are an island. And as a head teacher, you are an island. You are the person that the book stops with. And you need people that you can trust to bounce things off, to make sure that you are making confident, credible decisions all the way through. Because you can't, as I said before, you can't be an expert in everything. So you do need those people around you to support you.
And do you find, as you went into that headship then, and you know, as you say, you're an island, but you need to work, you need to have that network of people. How often did you lean on others in terms of bouncing ideas off as a leader? So in terms of, did you find yourself having to ultimately make decisions alone, or were you bouncing ideas and making decisions together? What was your style of leadership once you were in that role?
So for me, one of the most important things is ensuring staff know what they can make decisions on. And really early on, this is one of the first things that I kind of discovered in leadership, really, for me, that actually staff don't always know what their autonomy is in an organization, and being really clear from day one, actually, you've got the autonomy to go and do that. I don't need to see it again. I don't need to look at it again. Or equally, the other way around. Actually, I want to hold your hand through that process, because I want to make sure you do it right, or I want to make sure we get to the outcome that we need to get to. And just being clear in your own mind about that, and then with other colleagues as well. So for me, it's about initially making sure that colleagues knew what they had autonomy for, but again, all the time. And the school I was going into, because I've been a deputy head there for, you know, a 6-month period, I knew the staff. But even, you know, going in as a deputy head when I didn't know the school at all, really, it's looking at, you know, we had staff that have been there for 20+ years. They know the school inside out. It would be naive of me to come in, as you know, I alluded to before, and say, this is how I've done it before and it's worked, so we're going to do it in exactly the same way here, because it's not going to work. And actually, you need to take the staff with you. So I think a really important thing that we do, and again, you know, technology now really helps us. Microsoft Forms, Google Forms, all those sorts of things that you can do to get stakeholder feedback, really low stakes. You know, getting, you know, verbal, you know, conversations with colleagues, so important. But also looking outside of your setting as well. Go and have a look at what other people are doing. How are other people doing this? You know, looking at the emails from the DFE, looking at, you know, emails from your union about the feedback they're getting from colleagues. All those sources of networks are really, really important. If you try and do it on your own, you will sink, because it is an impossible job to do in isolation.
And it was interesting. You said, yeah, you've touched on recruitment a couple of times, which would be great to move into. And we discussed this off air actually a few weeks ago in terms of what we might discuss on the podcast, and we talked a little bit about recruitment. And obviously, I knew you were moving into your new role as well. So obviously, having just done that, could you talk to us more about your experience of being a candidate within leadership interviews. So what did you find really good about them, but also what would you perhaps change in that process? Because obviously it's, you've got long listing, short listing, the application forms, the cover letter, the visit to the school, and then you've got maybe a 2-day process of interviews as well. So could you talk us through your experience of, any sort of leadership post that you might have gone for before, what that was like, but also what you would perhaps change about it, but also what was great about it as well?
I think for me, and again, I'll flip it around its head a little bit to start with. So we've recruited a number of staff to my as in what will now be old school for September, and we recruited a senior leadership post, assistant head teacher, and we had a significant volume of applicants, and a number of them came to look around the school, which I think is really, really important to do, because it makes you not just a bit of paper, it makes you actually a name, it makes you a person, it makes you a personality. But one of the people that came for that turned up late. And actually, for me as a leader, one of the things that I am really clear with staff about is what the expectations are. And lateness is one of the things. It's for me, it's a red line. And for someone to turn up late and to not apologise for turning up late, and the way they did that, for me as a leader in a school, think straight away, actually, you are not the candidate that I want working in my school. So flipping it on its head, actually, for me as a candidate going into the school, going to look at the school, is really, really important. Doing your homework beforehand is incredibly important as well. Making sure you've read all those things, the Ofsted, any kind of Section 48 reports, DCI, SIAMs, depending on the school. Making sure that you've got a really clear understanding of the data of the school, enough about the contextual element of the trust as well, to make sure you've got those bits of the jigsaw that you can map together. Anything on the, rinse the website for policies, procedures, anything you've got. And I think you have to do that before you go and have a look around the school. And some people ask such naive questions when they go to look around schools that they could find on the website straight away. And actually, for me, again, it rings as a head teacher alarm bells of, this is someone that hasn't done their legwork before they've come and had this conversation. Is this someone I'm going to employ and want to work with? Probably not. But for me, going into a school is really important for you to get a sense of the culture, a sense of the climate. You pick up and you perceive so much in that 2-hour walk round of a school. If they take you and put you in an office somewhere to have a conversation, then you leave the office again, you're thinking, I wonder what behaviour's like. I wonder what lesson changeovers are like. I wonder what the teaching and learning's like. Whereas my experiences haven't been that. They've been very much, open. We'll go for a walk around the school. Doesn't matter what time of the day it is. Lesson change. If you can get and see those things, it makes a huge difference to your perception of the school. The application process is a nightmare. I'm not going to lie. It is fast sometimes, and you just have to go through the trick. You have to go through the process. Again, one of the things that I learned early on in leadership is, and this sounds ridiculous, having 2 or 3 screens in your office is a lifesaver. I don't know why nobody ever told me this before, because you can multitask, as in emails on one screen, this on the other screen, and actually it makes your life so much easier. For applications, it's exactly the same. Copying and pasting, because you do it from one to another. If you have to apply for more than one job, it just makes your life so much easier. But the application process is faffy, but it's easy enough. And then really it's about, as I say, continuing doing your legwork, continuing doing your homework, making sure that you are aware of what the culture of that school is, because you can be the best candidate on paper, but if you're not aligned to the culture of that school, you're unlikely to be the successful candidate.
And how did you find the actual interview process? I'm assuming you've done 2-day interview, which is the norm for a lot of headship level posts. How did you find that? Were you put into different scenarios? What was the process that you went through? How did you handle that?
So I've been through a couple of processes actually for headship. The one I've got wasn't the first one that I applied for, and they do a number of different activities depending on what they're looking for. So one of the most common things nowadays is a fishbowl type activity, where you're given a question and they just say, here's your question, we're going to watch for 20 minutes and just see how you interact. And again, I think at that point it's about making sure that you are saying things that are credible, making sure that you are standing your ground enough, but making sure you're not being too dominating. But equally not second guessing yourself as well. You've got to be your own personality in that situation. So there's a lot of that kind of fishbowl activity taking place. Written tasks, data tasks are going to be in there at some point. So doing your homework, do you know what kind of data comes into school looking like? making sure you're aware of progress, all those things, in secondary leadership, SAT results and analysis of that. Primary school, do you have that knowledge and skill set? And if you're going in as a deputy head or, other different leadership role and you haven't got experience of that, it's making sure you know about it. Again, depending on the school you're going into, look, you might have finance tasks because not every school's got a finance team like a multi-academy trust might have. So you may be leading and managing finance as well, reading the policies, reading their procedures, safeguarding tasks. And then that's just all the stuff that you don't get, outside of the formal interview type processes, presentations. And again, the presentations, they often give you the kind of day before. So if it's a 2-day process, you might get it on the end of day 1 to prep for day 2. So again, in terms of a shortcut, really, my advice would be prepping the PowerPoint presentation or whatever format you choose to use earlier. So if you find out a week in advance you're going to have an interview, set up a PowerPoint template, take photos off the school's website of their kids in their setting, take their mission statements, you format the whole thing, because that's one thing you don't have to then worry about when you've done your presentation. It's just the content. You get it on there because you're going to have 2-3 hours the night before to prep that presentation. So you want the formatting all done, all ready to go. So really, yeah, you're looking at lesson obs, you're looking at, walk rounds, learning walks, those sorts of things. It's a tiring process. I remember one process I went to and they got us in for 7:30 and they were really, really clear about that. Again, going back to what I said earlier, thanks for all being here on time. It's a test. If you can't be here for 7:30, you're not the candidate that we want to appoint at the end of the day. So it's making sure that you are showing the best version of yourself. But as I said before, not second guessing yourself either. If you're not the candidate for that school, you have to take that. You have to, accept that, because that school is not going to be the right one for you either.
Yeah, of course. And to flip that on its head, because obviously you will have recruited people as a head teacher as well, or as a deputy head, you'll have been involved in that process. Has the route you've taken when you've interviewed candidates been similar to that? Have you done anything different? And would you change anything about it if you had the power to say, yes, we're going to change the way we recruit leaders within our schools? What would that look like?
Yeah, so I think that one of the big things is around some many schools have started, and trusts have started doing this, is giving candidates the formal questions in advance of the interview. And the rationale for that in many settings is that actually, I wouldn't ask you if I appointed you. If I appointed you as a deputy head teacher, I wouldn't ask you to come to an SLT meeting without having done any preparation at all. I will give you the opportunity. You'll know what's on the agenda for next week, so you'll have time to prepare for it. And I don't want to hear just what you can think of off the top of your head. I want to hear about your in-depth responses to, scenario-based things. I want to hear your in-depth answers to different elements, because we're going to cover most bases. We're going to cover safeguarding. We're going to cover data. We're going to cover this. And I want to know what you can come up with, given the time to prep, because that's what you're going to have on the job. A lot of the time, not all the time, but you're going to have that time strategically to prepare. So that's a really big thing. I think it's a really positive thing. Lots of schools are doing that now. And for me, I still think that a critical element of leadership interviews should be a teaching task, because fundamentally, in most schools, unless you're, my new school is actually a principal role, but you're called a something teacher, assistant head teacher, deputy head teacher, head teacher. So having the capacity to teach and lead teaching and learning should be integral to everything you do as a senior leader in a school.
And in regards to that process as well, so is there anything in particular that you look for in their characteristics? So obviously you've said there, you've talked about skill set, you should be able to teach, be there on time. Is there anything you look at in terms of characteristics of the person when you're interviewing them, or even shortlisting them for a potential interview?
Yeah, they've got to fit into the team that's already there. And sadly, that sometimes means that you don't, and this is not talking from direct experience, but it could mean that you don't always necessarily appoint who on paper is the best candidate, because even though they might be the most experienced candidate, you're looking for someone to fit in a team of people. And actually, if you've got 2 candidates that both have the same skills or might have slightly different experience or different lengths of experience, you might go for one candidate over another because they fit into a team better. And actually, personality is what makes you appointable as a candidate, but you can't change that. And I would advise people against trying to change and get their personality perceived in one way because they think it's the right thing to do. Because as a credible leader, you've got to have your own personality. You've got to go in with your own personality. And if you try and adapt to something different as a persona just for the sake of an interview process, you're going to be found out quite quickly, I think. But yeah, so for me, it's fitting into a team, but also fitting into the culture that you want as well. And that's why getting into the school early. I can give you an example that in the school I've just been appointed to, they talk about the fact that they are very, very inclusive, and one of their mottos is about being inclusive, and it's the strapline for lots of stuff they do. They're pushing on a big reading project this year that's evidence-based, etc., etc. Actually, lots of things they're looking for in interviews is around being inclusive. And you can't pick up those subtle things without reading stuff and without going in and speaking to people. That's how you pick up those cultural aspects that you wouldn't necessarily pick up by just having, that telephone conversation, by just, reading the brochure they send you. You've got to dig deeper into the stuff that the school sends you, and that when you go for your look round as well. But for me, in terms of making candidates a pointable personality, definitely. Having the knowledge and skill set to do the job that you want them to do, because you'd never want to set someone up to fail. And again, you have to be really clear that actually you might not be the expert in the area that school is looking for. If you've got pastoral experience or you've got curriculum experience, but they're looking for someone to lead data or safeguarding and you've never done that, that's okay, because you can't be everything all of the time. And as I said before, even up until headship, you haven't done everything. So you're not going to be the right candidate for every school in every context. But I think the kind of final thing for me really is about, for candidates, and something that we often talk about and often ask, is what have you read? What are you reading at the minute? What kind of research are you looking into at the moment? Because that is often a telltale sign as to how current their practice is. Looking at outwardly is a big thing in education now. We used to be very insular. We're now much more outlooking, and pinching things from the schools or the settings, looking at the research, etc. So I think the more of that candidates do, the better.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And obviously, you'll have seen a lot of that in regard to, in the Teaching School Alliance, for example, when you were working with different leaders, sharing practice across, numerous multi-academy trusts in that particular diocese. Having worked with different leaders, collaborated, what do you think makes a good leader within a school?
Authenticity. I really do. I think that if you are not authentic, if you are not yourself, if you are not consistent, it's the same as going to a classroom of kids, isn't it? If you're not consistent with those students, they don't know where they stand. You have to be consistent with the staff as well. And if that means sometimes falling out with people and ruffling a few feathers because it's the right thing to do, you sometimes have to do it. And, I'm not sitting here saying that every decision I've ever made has been popular, but I've done it because I think it was the right thing to do for the young people. And if the staff don't like it, that sometimes is tough. And as a leader, you have to take that and the burden of that, because actually the right thing for the students isn't always the right thing that the staff want to be able to do, or that fundamentally that's what they're there for. They're there to get the best outcomes for students. So from my perspective, it's about making sure that as a leader you are putting students first in everything you do.
Yeah. And on the topic of having strong leaders, what are the main challenges currently in sourcing those good leaders? I mean, obviously you've got different experience because you've worked in the Catholic sector, and there's definitely nuances, and I suppose you could answer this in both forms or just in one of those, but for you and with your experience, Matt, what are the biggest challenges to sourcing leadership talent at the moment?
I think it's looking at matching skill set, as I said earlier. I think, for example, the leaders that I've worked with in schools, and many of them have been in leadership for so long that they haven't, and they've often been doing one thing in leadership for that period of time as well. They haven't got the skill set to do those other things. So I think, again, as I said earlier, for me, the earlier in people's career they can do a variety of things. I'll give you an example of what I haven't really done. I haven't really done much on safeguarding throughout my career. And it wasn't until I became a director of performance and standards and the CEO said to me, "You are now the Trust's deputy safeguarding lead." And I thought, right, I should probably do some work around safeguarding, in more detail than just reading and doing the training on keeping children safe in education every year. I probably need a bit more to make, another string to my bow on that. But it doesn't, as I said before, even as a head teacher, you can't have done everything all of the time. So for me, it's about making sure that they've got as wide of experience as possible, But I think that starts with candidates as much as it starts with schools. So looking at where you can rotate leaders around. So going into my new school, I've just rotated leadership around a little bit because they've been, some of them have been there for a number of years, taken some things off some people and given them different things because actually it's the right thing for them. It's the right thing for the school as well. After, 4 or 5 years, someone different needs to look at this area of the school to make sure it's working as best as it possibly can work. So I think as a leader, it's always pushing to develop your breadth of skills and knowledge. And I think in terms of pipeline to leadership, it's making sure that candidates have got the breadth of experience that you're looking for, the knowledge for those things. But I also think it's around understanding of context. And this is why, as you mentioned before, the Leadership Academy, what it again stifled a little bit during COVID. One of the things we encouraged people to do was to do a placement, to do a little bit of time elsewhere, a project, ideally linking up with somebody elsewhere in another setting. Because, as a leader, again, it goes back to the old adage that people like leaders to have worked in more than one school in their leadership career, because it gives you that, and that's what the teaching school gave me, that outward looking. 3 or 4 different schools have done that, but they do this in these different ways. And that's what makes a really credible leader. They've seen it in different settings, they've done it in different ways, and they can demonstrate the impact of that. But I think the biggest, to go back to the question, the biggest challenge in the kind of leadership is the pipeline of leaders, particularly in those niche areas, because they haven't all, got that skill set. And a prime example of that is Senkos. Really struggle to recruit Senkos, really struggle to recruit people with significant safeguarding experience. And often it's dumped onto a deputy head that doesn't really want to do it because they're the deputy head teacher. So again, in terms of leadership, it's about making sure candidates have got a broad range of skills that allows them to be credible in the post you're appointing to.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of conversations around this topic, and one of the things that crops up sometimes is the fact that some deputy heads will look at a head teacher and what they do and the amount of weight they have to carry on their shoulders and think, well, actually, no, I don't want to do that. I think, the buck stops here with my career, and I'm happy to sort of sit at this level as a deputy head. Could schools be doing more to encourage people? I know you mentioned the Leadership Academy, which sounds fantastic. Could schools be or academy trusts be doing more to entice people to go up to that level of headship?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that lots of trusts are trying to do that through head of school type roles and exec head roles. So you almost have that sample of what it could look like if you were to have it yourself in the future. But I think you're right. I think that work-life balance is so important as a leader. And again, quite early in my headship, it was COVID. Everything was electronic because that just had to be the way it was. And I had my emails on my phone, on my personal phone, and they were coming into my main inbox. It was every night, you sit down at the telly for 15, 20 minutes, you're scrolling on your phone, aren't you? And it's either, it's often now it's like LinkedIn, it's your emails, isn't it? And things are popping at 9:45 at night. You're thinking, right, I've got to go and open up my laptop now. But actually, I said to senior leaders, relatively early on, I've stopped doing that because actually that's not healthy for me. And you're then not getting the best from me the following day. I said to them, if you need me, just text me or ring me. If you email me, it's fine, but I'm not going to pick it up till the next morning. When I've stopped working, I've stopped working. If there's an emergency, fine, we'll deal with that. But if you need me, I'm not going to pick up an email. And actually, that worked well because other senior leaders did exactly the same thing. They said, you know what, actually, it makes absolute sense. So I think there are things that head teachers can also do to I guess change the perception around headship. I've absolutely loved the last 2 years of the role that I've done. I've enjoyed most of the time I've spent as the head teacher there, because every day does bring challenges and different settings and different situations bring the challenges. But for me, it's about being, as I said, being authentic and actually doing what you think the right thing for you as a leader is, and not trying to mimic or copy anybody else in the way they do things. And I say this often to leaders as well. A couple of things that actually come to me with a solution, not a problem. Don't come to me with a problem and say, this is a problem I've got. Try and tell me how to solve the problem in your experience. If it's a problem in your area, what does your expertise tell you the solution could be? And as a head, you're then not making all the decisions. And equally, making sure that colleagues understand, as I said before, what they've got the autonomy to make decisions on. I think they're really, really important things. And that then does, I think, in some way go to supporting other leaders, seeing that headship is actually something that is achievable. It is, don't get me wrong, it is knackering. Some days you get 200-300 emails in a day, and you get to 8 o'clock at night, you're thinking, actually, I've not even looked at my emails today because so much has happened throughout the day. So you do get days like that, but equally, the vast majority of days are so rewarding. And again, one other thing I would say is that something that we've really encouraged is in line management as head teacher and senior leader colleagues is going for a walk around the school, because the impact isn't in line management, the impact is what we do in the school. And if we can't see it tangibly taking place in the school, it's not really having the impact we think it has and the impact that we're writing down on our line management paperwork.
Yeah, of course. And those people that are stepping up for headships, obviously, we're seeing on the recruitment side of things more and more headship posts. You know, people, head teachers retiring early, for example, particularly after the pandemic, people leaving the sector completely and maybe doing other stuff. More people going into maybe consultancy because they don't want to run a school anymore. They want to sort of maybe parachute in, support schools. And there's a lot of competition, let's say, for maybe 3 schools in an area that's all looking for their next head teacher, and only so many candidates, let's say, that are actually actively looking for roles. Do you think schools, or particularly academy trust now, since it's on the agenda of every school being in an academy trust in the next 8 years, is there things that schools or academies just could be doing more of to become an employer of choice versus people just applying, let's say, to 5 different headship roles at the same time?
Yeah, I think growing your own is a huge thing. I think that gone are the days where, again, particularly in a geographical area, because of social media, because of networking, it's, unless you're moving from a completely different area of the country, it's unlikely you're not a known entity to someone in the organisation. Even going to a school that I'd never worked in before, a trust I'd never worked in before, there were still people in that school that knew me. I'd worked with them before, or I'd taught their child something before. So that's going to happen somewhere. I think that multi-academy trust, you're right, growing their own is really, really important. I think becoming an employer of choice also starts early on in career as well. It's looking at things like exit interviews. What meant that 20% of our ECTs left within the first 3 years of being an ECT within the trust. What's led to that? What can we do differently to make sure that we don't have that repeated in the future? In terms of employees of choice, loads are doing incentive schemes and all those sorts of things now as well. And I think one of the most important things that's developed in the last few years, certainly, is the support around mental health. It's really, really important. Employee assistance programs, all those sorts of things. And I think, as a leader, it's about making sure that as a leader, you are incredibly supportive of your staff. You cannot run a school on your own. You can't do every role within the school. You need your staff in there to do it. So I think that becoming an employer of choice starts with being a people person and making sure you get the very best out of your people.
Yeah, wow. And obviously that then falls into the attraction, because obviously part of our fabric at MLK is to sort of change the way recruitment's done, particularly in that sourcing, validating, long listing, shortlisting, for example. Is there anything that needs to change, in your opinion, as a leader within education, in terms of the advertisement? Because that links into being an employer of choice, let's say, doesn't it? So are the schools that you've worked in before, do they use the traditional methods? Have they done anything different to get ahead of others, let's say?
No, I think you're right. And I think actually behaviour type matching is really, really important. Going back to what I said before, a more credible candidate, a more suitable candidate for me is someone whose skills and personality matches what I'm looking for. And you could have 30 applicants for an assistant head job, but actually I'm looking for somebody who's got experience of X, Y, and Z. They might have experience of other things, but that's less important for me as a leader. As a head teacher, I want somebody who has got a specific set of skills to come in. And if they've got extra things, great, that's an added bonus. But having that, as kind of alluded to, the behaviour profile and that matching, I think is so important, because that's what you need in your team. If you're losing a deputy head, what skills they're bringing to a team. What you need to replace them with, or how you can move the parts around in your team to make different spaces, and that's fine. But you then know what you're looking to recruit back into that team as well. So I think that's really, really important. And we're at risk sometimes of as you mentioned, having a situation where you end up with many candidates, many of whom haven't got the skills for the role that you're looking for, or don't meet the culture that you have in the school or in the setting, because you haven't explicitly mentioned those things in your advertising process. And actually, if you're more explicit around the culture, around the position of the school, you don't want to air your dirty laundry necessarily all the time. You've got to be realistic. If your school's in challenging circumstances, you've got to be able to clearly articulate that to people that are applying, because they need to know the level of work required and the level of skills you're looking for to support the school out of that, and vice versa. If you're a school that's pushing for or is outstanding, you need to be really clear that actually from day one we're looking for somebody to come in who's got a really clear understanding and has worked on that model to get the school to outstanding. You then filter your candidates significantly. But as I say, under traditional methods, schools aren't very good at doing that themselves. They lead to an open field of candidates, which is great because you get curveballs, you get people that you don't necessarily expect, but you also lead yourself to having a wide range of candidates who don't meet the brief that you need them to have, even though they've got the experience.
Yeah, and that's a big thing in terms of personality, like you're saying. We hear stories all the time of people going in and either withdrawing or being taken out of that process after you've had to have the shortlisting meeting, look through all the profile, everything else, and then essentially they're not the right fit, and that's apparent as soon as they're within the school. So yeah, some really good points there. Matt, we always ask everyone to go over some top tips for people that are either considering going into leadership or are currently within a leadership role and looking to learn from others. We generally ask for around 5. I don't think I gave you a number. I think I just said, just any tips that you might have. Are there any particular tips that you would give to people that listen to this within education that you think would be really helpful for them to carry with them in a career?
I think for me, I've written a few things down, so I'll read and stuff there. I think the most important thing for me, and where I saw leadership being done differently, shall I say, is where people weren't themselves. You almost had 2 or 3 different personalities of the same person, depending on the situation they found themselves in. I would hope my staff would say that I was authentic. I hope they would say that I was supportive and compassionate. It doesn't mean I won't give a member of staff a ticking off if they deserve a ticking off, but I'll do it in a way that's supportive. Equally, I'll celebrate success when it's the right thing to do as well. And being yourself and being authentic is really, really important, because if you're not that, you've been appointed for that reason, that you've gone into the interview, hopefully you've been yourself and you are the best candidate because your skills, personality, knowledge matches the brief and the school and the culture and the climate. So if you then change and modify that, you're doing yourself and the school a disservice. So for me, being authentic, that credible leader I mentioned before, I think is the most important thing. I think following that, it's the fact that people matter. And actually, as I said, a number of times, you can't do the job in isolation. You have to do it with a team of people. I am not an English teacher, so I cannot advise better than the head of English on English. There are a number of books, that you can read, and can I reference specific books?
Yeah.
So Her, for example, by Mary Myatt. There are a number of different things that talk about line management and better line management, how you can do that better if you're not a specialist in a certain area. And I think doing some of those things, and as a line manager, being aware of your own shortcomings and areas that you need to develop, you can still hold people to account, but you do it in a different way. So I think it's being aware of what you don't know, but always doing it in a supportive way and supporting people, making sure that your people matter and that you're clear about that. I gave SLT a Christmas present. So I started in November 2020, December 2020, I gave them a Christmas present, which was a book around school leadership and making sure that staff wellbeing was at the forefront. And actually, that for them was the first time that they'd had experience of that. And that's not to say they were doing it badly at all, but it was during COVID. It was the first sort of extended lockdown, and that had not been something they'd considered before. So putting the people first, I think, is really, really important. And I do think switching off is invaluable, because you're not going to be the best version of yourself at 7:30 the following morning if you're still working at 11 o'clock at night. And that sounds flippant, because there are days you need to do that and you feel like you have to do that to get the work shifted, but it's not sustainable longer term. It really, really isn't. You've got to be strict with that, with yourself and with your staff as well. And I think also reading stuff, being outward focused, outward facing, reading, literature, reading books, going out and seeing things in practice in the schools, invaluable. And I think finally for me, but possibly most importantly, linked to internal school leadership, is challenging each other. As a leader, you must be comfortable in a room with senior leadership challenging each other. And if you're not, you're in the wrong setting. I do, however, say to senior leadership, we need to get things right in line management meeting. Gone are the days where we need to become presenting 20 different possibilities and options. We need to filter that down to 2 or 3 things and take those 2 or 3 things to senior leadership team. But we can still have challenge on it. We don't need to get upset when someone tells us it's wrong or they think there's a better way of doing it, because all feedback is valuable feedback. And equally, that person doesn't need to get upset when we ignore what they have to say. And leadership is about that all the time, because we can't all be experts in every field, and we can't all have our contributions built into every single answer that the school's got for something.
Yeah, wow, I love that last point as well. I'm a big advocate of sort of leaning on others and challenging perceptions, and definitely I'm quite a big sort of bookworm myself. I read quite a lot, so one of those points really resonates with me. I'm always sort of reading new things and sharing that with other people. We do that in our office, actually. We have a sort of like a learning library where we just bring books in and people can share those books between themselves. So yeah, I'm a big advocate, so I love that point. Listen, Matt, that brings us to the end of this. I just want to thank you so much for firstly appearing on a day when A levels are going out, and I know you've had a really busy day, but also just for sharing that wealth of knowledge, because I just think people are going to listen to this and learn so much from it and take a lot from there. And even myself, we work on the recruitment side here at MLK, where we have conversations with senior leaders daily, and we're representing a lot of those people into new positions. So from our own perspective, it's great. But what as I said to you off air, we're trying to create this community through podcasting where people can share practice, whether they're in the south of England or the northeast of England or somewhere in Lincolnshire where it's more remote, let's say, than Manchester, for example. So thank you so much. It's really inspiring, and it's great to, particularly because we've known each other for a few years as well, just to actually dig into your career a bit and learn more about what you've done as an individual. So I really, really respect the fact that you've managed to come on today and share that knowledge with us. So thank you again for doing that.
Pleasure. No, and thank you for your time. And I think, as you say, contextual-based school leadership is difficult, and the more that people can understand context, the more their behaviours can be matched to a school, the culture, the climate the school's trying to develop and build, because that's its USP at the end of the day, the better. So thanks for everything you're trying to do in the sector as well.
No, not a problem at all. And finally, just to our listeners as well, if you like this, go onto our website, which is www.mlk-search.co.uk. You'll find all our podcasts will be on there moving forward. But we also put this out onto LinkedIn as well, because our podcast goes onto Spotify, where you can listen to it, or our YouTube channel as well, where you can actually watch these. This is why we record the videos as well, so you can actually watch us doing it. Matt, thank you again, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you. Take care.